The metallic sound of the tray falling echoed through the crowded McDonald's dining room, followed by peals of laughter that burned like invisible blades into the young waitress's skin. Soda cups spilled across the floor, soaking her old, stained sneakers, as an arrogant customer's voice cut through the air with contempt. "This is why you'll never make it out of this life, incompetent." People in line looked on, some with pity, others with a hidden, cruel smile. Her face flushed, her teary eyes filled with shame, but she stood firm, silently picking up every bit of humiliation that had fallen to the floor. It was as if everyone had stopped to watch the spectacle of her defeat. The customer, in an expensive suit and a haughty gaze, lifted his chin as if he had won something, while the girl took a deep breath, trying not to let the pain burst into tears in front of everyone. It was at that moment, when the silence of shame seemed to engulf every corner of the restaurant, that a deep, unexpected voice rose from the back. It wasn't an ordinary voice, but one that commanded effortless respect, charged with a cold yet cutting calm. "Apologize to her, now." Heads turned, and eyes fell on a man who had previously gone unnoticed. The arrogant customer snickered until a murmur began to spread through the place. Someone recognized him. This man wasn't just anyone. He was a well-known millionaire in the city, a businessman who didn't show up in places like this without reason. The arrogant man swallowed hard, while the waitress's heart raced. The tables had turned in seconds, but not in the way anyone could have predicted, because the millionaire wasn't just defending a stranger. He knew her, and in his eyes he carried a secret no one else could decipher. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. The restaurant was packed on that sultry New York summer afternoon, the air conditioning fighting in vain against the heat that seeped through the glass doors with each customer. Who arrived? The smell of fried food, freshly fried potatoes and grilled burgers, mingled with the metallic sound of trays hitting the counter and the hum of rapid conversation, as if each voice were just part of a greater collective noise. The lines were long, the servers scurried back and forth, and in the midst of that organized chaos stood she, the waitress in a wrinkled uniform, her hair hastily tied back, and her eyes weary but attentive. She carried more trays in her hands than she could balance, almost as if she wanted to prove to the world that she could carry more weight than anyone else. Customers rarely looked at her as someone, just as part of the machine, an invisible figure who only gained prominence when she made a mistake. And that day everyone was about to see not just the mistake, but the way cruelty could turn a slip into a spectacle. Among the tables, one group stood out above all others. Men in well-cut suits, expensive watches reflecting the artificial overhead. Lights, laughter that sounded more like displays of power than genuine amusement. In the center, one of them spoke louder, gesturing as if he wanted everyone in the restaurant to know he was someone important. His tone carried arrogance, each word dripping with superiority, and the looks he cast at the waitress were more judgmental than simple curiosity. He seemed to be waiting for the exact moment she would stumble, like a predator on the prowl, eager to turn weakness into a source of mockery. The girl, however, was focused on her tasks. She moved quickly, dodging children running between tables, balancing trays and glasses with the dexterity of someone who had learned to manage by force. There was something silent in her resilience, a hidden strength no one seemed to notice. But behind that cheap uniform and worn sneakers lay a soul marked by pain no customer would ever imagine. Her every step was sustained not by pride, but by necessity, as if life had forced her to continue even. When her strength was gone, across the room, barely noticeable in his discreet presence, stood a man alone. Unlike the noisy group, his posture was restrained, his gaze fixed on every detail of the scene, as if observing not only what was happening, but what was about to happen. He didn't flaunt his wealth, but there was something about the way he wore his dark suit, the serenity of his gestures, and the steadiness of his eyes that revealed a quiet authority. At every turn, he seemed to study the waitress as if recognizing a familiar shadow. The atmosphere grew more tense as the group of men began to whisper between laughs, discreetly pointing at her. One of them commented on the fate of the weak and people born to serve, drawing forced laughter from the others. The waitress pretended not to hear, but the flush on her cheeks betrayed that the words had penetrated her armor. The tension was almost palpable, as if the entire room were on the verge of collapse, waiting for the moment when everything would break. And it was in this scenario of sharp glances and poisoned laughter that the humiliation about to unfold began to take shape, stitched together by the contempt of some and the silent resistance of others. Her life had never been easy. As a child, she had learned the meaning of loss before she even understood what it meant to possess. She grew up in a small, cold house, where the peeling walls couldn't hide the cracks that time and lack of care had left. Her father had disappeared when she was just 6, leaving behind broken promises and the vague memory of a figure who would never return. Her mother, overwhelmed by temporary jobs and the need to feed her children, ended up more absent than present. Thus, the girl grew up as someone who learns too early to fend for herself, caring for her younger siblings, cooking with what little she had, and learning to smile so as not to scare others with the pain she carried. At school, things were never different. While other children arrived with new backpacks and snacks wrapped in colorful paper, she carried worn notebooks and often spent her breaks simply observing, pretending not to care about the hunger burning in her stomach. Her classmates saw her as strange, distant, and occasionally a cruel comment would slip out. Poor girl. Nobody wants to be her friend. It scarred her deeply, but instead of rebelling, she learned to keep quiet. She kept each word inside her like invisible scars, as if it were a constant reminder that the world had no mercy for the fragile. The years passed, and with them, her responsibility only increased. When she finally reached adolescence, her mother fell ill, leaving her practically alone to support the household. She worked in bakeries, cleaned houses, and babysat for neighbors who treated her with disdain, as if her presence were merely a convenience. Every penny saved was a victory, but also a bitter reminder of how much she had to fight for, things others had effortlessly. While her classmates talked about parties and college plans, she spent her nights caring for her mother and counting coins to buy bread the next day. When her mother passed away, the loneliness became even more piercing. Her older siblings went their separate ways, and she was left with the heavy silence of someone who lost not only her family, but also her sense of belonging. It was during this time that she got a job at McDonald's. To many, it was just a temporary gig, but to her it represented survival. The simple uniform, low pay, and long hours on her feet didn't scare her. What really hurt was the way people looked at her. To some customers, she was nothing more than part of the furniture, a replaceable piece, someone who didn't even deserve a thank you. But behind her tired eyes there was a flame that still burned. She always believed that pain didn't come to destroy, but to shape. She held this idea like a silent faith, as if each humiliation in the past were merely a stepping stone to something she couldn't yet see. Deep down, she carried a shy, almost secret hope that one day the suppressed tears and days of exhausting work would have some meaning. And although the world didn't know it, inside her were stories, memories, and secrets that could change the way everyone saw her. The waitress who seemed invisible actually had a past that would be the key to a turnaround no one there could have foreseen. The afternoon dragged on at the restaurant, orders piled up, and the waitress struggled to keep up even as her body screamed for rest. Then, amid loud laughter and raised glasses, came the moment that would change everything. The group of suited men, already intoxicated with arrogance, began to whisper louder, completely unconcealed. One of them, the most arrogant and sarcastic, regarded the waitress with a look of contempt and said, "Want to bet she'll knock everything over before she gets here? Those poor." Hands weren't made to hold anything. Laughter erupted around the table, and soon the provocation turned into a challenge. They bet $100 bills on the tray she carried. They weren't betting on a card game or stock market numbers. They were betting on the dignity of a young woman who fought every day to stay on her feet. As she walked firmly across the room, unaware of what was being plotted, eyes fixed on her as if at a cruel spectacle, the most insolent man, the one who had launched. The bet made a point of discreetly sticking out his foot as she passed, almost imperceptibly, as if it were merely a careless gesture. But it was enough. The tray slipped, the glasses scattered in the air and crashed to the floor, the liquid splashing everywhere, including the provocateur's own impeccable suit. The laughter that echoed wasn't just about the accident, it was about the victory of evil disguised as a game. For them, nothing was more amusing than seeing someone reduced to shame in front of an audience. The waitress froze for a moment. Her heart was racing, her face flushed, her hands trembling as she tried to quickly pick up the pieces of that humiliating scene. She could feel the eyes fixed on her, not only from the laughing men, but also from the customers who watched silently, like those watching a cheap show. None of them knew she had been carrying on years of silent struggles, but there, in that moment, it was as if all her effort had been undone in seconds by a cruel joke. The man in the expensive suit stood up, feigning indignation at the soda on his clothes, but his voice dripped with sarcasm. "Look at that. She's even efficient at ruining things. I wonder how much she pays a month. $10 and a free meal. Maybe that's why she always comes back to the same place." The laughter echoed again, even louder, as if each word were a sentence that marked the difference between two worlds. She, the invisible one, he, the powerful one, but not everyone, laughed. From the back of the restaurant, a man's eyes remained fixed on the scene without a hint of a smile. It wasn't just indignation that flashed through his eyes, but something deeper, as if every gesture and word of the arrogant man stirred old memories that mingled with the present. As the waitress bent down to pick up the pieces, choking back tears to avoid showing weakness, fate began to prepare the silent twist that would transform that humiliation into something no one would forget. She was still on her knees picking up the wet pieces of trays and glasses when she felt a shadow fall across the floor. For a moment, she thought it was just another impatient customer, but the voice she heard carried no impatience, but something unexpected, firmness and respect. "Leave it. I'll take care of it." The waitress looked up, and before her stood the man in the dark suit who had remained silent until then. He bent down, unconcerned about getting his hands dirty, and picked up one of the spilled glasses, as if the gesture were the most natural thing in the world. The entire room was in suspense. No one expected to see a clearly wealthy man, someone who could have worked at any upscale restaurant in the city, crouching on the floor of a McDonald's to help a waitress. The group of suits looked on with disdain, exchanging looks of astonishment and muffled laughter. But the man's expression left no room for jokes, his eyes, dark and intense, locked with hers. And the waitress felt something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just a stranger offering help. There was a familiarity there, as if that gaze recognized her from somewhere she couldn't quite remember. Her heart raced, not from embarrassment, but from the strange feeling that their encounter was no coincidence. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, almost as if he didn't want the others to hear. She nodded quickly, gathering up more shards with trembling hands, unable to hold his gaze for long. "No need to be ashamed. It wasn't your fault." His words carried a different weight, as if they were meant to reach not just her ears, but the hidden wounds she'd carried since childhood. At that moment, the arrogant man who had initiated the bet stood up and huffed, irritated by the scene. "Look, even a millionaire decided to play knight-errant now. Careful or you'll end up slipping in the same mud as that one." The sentence scratched the air like a knife, but the millionaire didn't even look away. There was no rush in his posture, no need to prove anything. He simply stood there, his presence firm, exuding an authority that silenced even the most daring. The waitress tried to get up, but he offered his hand. For a second, she hesitated. She wasn't used to receiving help, much less from someone like that. Finally, she accepted, and when her fingers touched his, a silent current seemed to run through the room. There was no logical explanation, but there was an emotional weight hanging in the air. Something neither of them was yet ready to understand. She murmured a barely audible, "Thank you," and he simply responded with a slight nod, as if words were unnecessary. Back at his desk, the millionaire remained silent, but his eyes discreetly followed her as she tried to resume her work, hiding her embarrassment behind hurried movements. The arrogant group still laughed, but it no longer sounded as confident. There was something in the air that was beginning to unsettle their false superiority, and though no one there knew it, that simple contact had opened a fissure in the cruel game they had played. A fissure that would soon become an abyss. If this scene has already made you feel the silent weight of a true gesture, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and write in the comments. Do you believe that a simple look can change the course of a life? The silence caused by the millionaire's unexpected gesture didn't last long. The group of suited men wouldn't accept the scene ending like this, with the waitress's dignity partially restored. The arrogant man, feeling his gamble exposed to ridicule, stood up again, his voice thick with irony and a venomous smile plastered on his face. "So that's it? Now even millionaires have fun playing fast food heroes? Let's give it up, gentlemen, for the savior of the poor and the princess of trays." His voice echoed louder than necessary, drawing forced laughter from his colleagues, who preferred to laugh rather than risk. Confronting the haughty posture of the group leader, the waitress took a deep breath, trying to remain firm, but each word felt like an invisible blade slicing through her skin. The man continued mercilessly, "Look at her. This is the picture of failure. People born to serve burgers who will never know life outside this cage of fryers. The difference between us and them is simple. We choose, they conform." Eyes in the restaurant turned to the scene, some in embarrassed silence, others with the morbid curiosity of those who can't resist witnessing a public downfall. The young woman felt her face heat up. She wanted to disappear, to be invisible again, but she was trapped there, the center of unwanted attention. Her tear-filled eyes shone not with weakness, but with a contained rage that burned in her chest, even though it hadn't yet found room to express itself. The millionaire remained silent, watching, but his expression hardened with each passing second. There was something in his calm that seemed more menacing than any immediate response. The arrogant man then delivered the final blow, as if driving a stake into an already wounded heart. He took $100 bill from his wallet and tossed it onto the tray she was holding, leaving the paper soaked with spilled soda. "Here you go. Maybe you can buy a new pair of shoes with this, since yours look like they survived a war." The laughter that followed was deafening, and the clapping of his colleagues echoed like a cruel coronation. The waitress said nothing. She simply looked at the dirty bill and then into his eyes, her silence carrying a dignity no one expected. There were no tears, no screams, just the heavy silence of someone who had faced greater humiliations than this. But inside, something was shifting. She knew she wasn't just a victim in this game. She knew more than she let on. And this secret, closely guarded, would soon become the piece that would tip the scales. The millionaire finally stood up. His height and posture imposed an uncomfortable silence among the tables. He said nothing, just stared at the arrogant man with a gaze that pierced like fire. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing something greater was coming. The public humiliation was complete, but fate had not yet had its final say. The silence that followed the humiliation seemed to choke the air. The waitress held the stained tray, her gaze fixed on the wet $100 bill, and everyone expected her to simply lower her head, collect the money as alms, and continue serving as always. But something different happened. With slow movements, she removed the bill from the tray, folded it carefully, and instead of putting it away, walked to the men's table. The entire room followed her every step, as if an invisible thread were drawing their collective attention to that unexpected gesture. When she stopped before them, her voice emerged, firm, clear, and surprisingly calm. "Funny how you think. You can bet on other people's lives as if it were some random game. But you know what's funny? I already knew you would do that." The words fell like stones to the table. The group exchanged confused glances, hoping it was just a soundbite. But she continued, without hesitation, "This isn't the first time you've done this. It's not the first time you've used someone as cheap entertainment. You think no one notices, that everything is hidden behind the laughter and the money you throw around to mask the emptiness. But I've always known, and contrary to what you think, I'm not ashamed to be here. You're the ones who should be ashamed." The entire room froze. The arrogant man gave a mocking smile, trying to regain control of the scene. "You? You knew? And what did you do? You kept serving burgers. That's all it's going to be." But deep down, there was an unease in his voice, as if his confidence was beginning to crack. The waitress, undeterred, placed the folded bill on his table. "Dirty. Money doesn't buy my dignity. Keep your bet. Maybe you need it more than I do." The laughter died away, and the weight of the gesture reverberated through the space. It wasn't just a response, it was a blow to the heart of arrogance. For the first time, it wasn't she who seemed small, it was them, reduced to their own cruelty, exposed before everyone. The millionaire watched in silence, but there was a different gleam in his eyes. It wasn't just pride in her gesture, it was recognition, as if finally confirming something he'd already suspected. The arrogant, irritated man leaned forward, but realized the room's attention was no longer on his side. The audience was no longer laughing. Many customers looked away, embarrassed. Others shook their heads in disapproval. The waitress didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to shout. She simply revealed that she already knew everything and wasn't afraid to face the truth. Her strength lay not in avoiding humiliation, but in enduring it, and returning it with dignity. And in that moment it became clear that the story wouldn't end there, because in the millionaire's silent, impenetrable gaze, there was more than solidarity. There was a hidden secret, a hidden connection between him and that young woman that no one but him seemed to understand. If this revelation has already made you feel the strength that exists in silence, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and write in the comments. Do you believe that those who are humiliated can become stronger than those who humiliate? After the waitress's firm response, the restaurant was enveloped in an uncomfortable silence, as if everyone was trying to process the scene. She returned to the counter with firm steps, but inside, her heart was pounding. The millionaire remained seated, watching her with almost obsessive attention. It wasn't just interest in the courageous gesture. There was something in that face that stirred dormant memories, an echo of a past he'd been trying to bury for years. When he finally stood up, he walked to the counter. The arrogant group watched him uneasily, but no one dared interfere. He approached the young woman and, in a low voice, asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, but answered simply, "Emily." The name echoed in his mind like a silent explosion. Emily, a name familiar to him. He knew that story, knew that surname that years ago had appeared in a forgotten lawsuit, in documents that had crossed his desk when he was still just a beginning investor. Suddenly everything made sense. He remembered a humble family who had lost everything because of an unfair corporate move, a company that had bought land and evicted dozens of families to build luxury condominiums. Among those people was a girl, the eldest daughter, who had witnessed the destruction of what little they had. The memory of the old news report, of a blurry photo in the newspaper showing a girl holding her mother's hand, came to him with painful clarity. That girl was now the woman before him. The millionaire's stomach churned. The weight of the truth fell upon him like a sentence. Unbeknownst to anyone, the waitress everyone saw as just another invisible worker was, in fact, one of the direct victims of the empire she had helped build. She knew everything, as she had said. She knew that those men, with their arrogant laughter, represented the same world that had crushed his childhood. And now he understood. Her presence. There was no coincidence. It was destiny. Emily noticed the change in his gaze. There was suppressed shock, an internal struggle that betrayed the discovery. She said nothing, just held his gaze, as if silently confirming what he had just remembered. There was no need for words. He knew, she knew. And the gulf between them was no longer in the clothes or the money, but in the memory of what had been taken from her, and what he had helped, albeit indirectly, to destroy. The millionaire took a step. "Samak," swallowing hard. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of guilt crushing his impeccable, upright posture. Emily turned away, resuming her tasks as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew the truth had already settled in like a wound impossible to ignore. If this discovery has already made you feel the impact of destiny, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and write in the comments. Do you believe that the past always finds a way to return? In the days that followed, the millionaire couldn't shake Emily's image from his mind. The scene at McDonald's, her firm voice, her look of dignity in the face of humiliation, all returned in flashes that tormented him even in the midst of the most important meetings. Sitting at the head of long glass tables, surrounded by executives who treated him with reverence, he could no longer hear anything. The voices became distant, muffled, because within him echoed only one certainty. There was something about Emily that completely disarmed him. But when he returned to the restaurant expecting to see her again, he received unexpected news. She had resigned. The counter seemed empty without her. The red uniform now wore another employee who served customers with haste and indifference. Emily had simply disappeared, as if she had dissolved into thin air. None of her co-workers knew for sure where she had gone. Some said she had gotten another job at a distant cafe. Others claimed she had left the city to quietly start a new life. But no one knew the truth. For the millionaire, this absence was like an open wound. Discovering who she was had already shaken him, but losing the chance to see her again turned that revelation into a silent obsession. He began to retrace his steps, revisiting old documents, forgotten journals, contracts that had shaped his career. Each page was a reminder of the injustice committed against her family. For the first time, the million-dollar figures and business victories rang hollow, almost poisoned. He realized his wealth was built on the ruins of people like Emily, and his conscience weighed on him like never before. At night, in the silence of the luxurious, cold apartment, he found himself wondering where she was, if she was okay, if she still held a grudge or simply indifference. The emptiness of her absence began to erode even his public image. The gala events that once filled his schedule became unbearable. Between glasses of champagne and practiced smiles, he saw only empty faces, comparing them with the steady eyes of the waitress who had faced him fearlessly. The truth was simple and cruel. He missed her, not just as someone misses someone, but as someone who discovers they've only now found something genuine in a world of superficiality. And this absence wasn't just desire, it was the pangs of conscience. Emily had become the living embodiment of what he never wanted to face, the injustice upon which his empire had grown. By disappearing, she not only left a void in the restaurant, but opened a chasm within it, a chasm that no amount of money, no deal, and no social acclaim could fill. The empire he had built seemed solid, unshakable, but all it took was a crack for the entire structure to begin to crumble. Emily's absence had instilled in him a restlessness he could no longer disguise, and this emptiness was reflected in every gesture, every meeting, every ill-considered decision. Newspapers began publishing articles about questionable company practices. Old contracts resurfaced like ghosts, and suddenly what had once been a source of pride became the target of investigation. The headlines carried cutting phrases: millionaire accused of enriching himself at the expense of poor families. The past he had tried to bury resurfaced before millions of eyes. Videos of the McDonald's scene began circulating on social media. Someone had discreetly filmed the bet, the humiliation, and the moment Emily returned the $100 bill. The internet was unforgiving. Comments were an avalanche of indignation. Is this how you treat workers? Money can't buy character. The arrogant group, once so confident, began to be publicly harassed, and even the millionaire's closest allies backed away, fearing being dragged into the same quagmire. He, who had always walked through gala halls to applause, now walked under disapproving glances. At investor meetings, there was no longer reverence, only distrust. Contracts began to be cancelled, and invitations to important events stopped arriving. What once seemed eternal began to crumble in a matter of weeks. The millionaire who once represented power now found himself cornered, cowering in his own shadow. But what consumed him most wasn't the public downfall. It was the memory of Emily. In every criticism, every headline, every accusatory look, he saw the reflection of her dignity, steadfast in the face of humiliation. He realized she had won. Without needing to raise her voice, that her silent strength now echoed like a relentless judgment. Her image, refusing the dirty money and returning the bet, had become a symbol of resistance for thousands of people who had never met her. The millionaire, alone in his apartment, watched his own reputation shredded before the cameras, but within him, the cruelest judgment came not from society, but from his own conscience. External justice might be temporary. It could be stifled by lawyers and influences. But Emily's silent justice was eternal. The weight of her gaze followed him like an inescapable sentence. He had lost contracts, friends, and prestige, but the true loss was deeper, his own. The millionaire who once walked with firm steps and a haughty gaze now barely recognized himself in the mirror. His expensive clothes no longer held the same weight. The gold watches he had so often flaunted seemed nothing more than shiny shackles binding him to the past. In the silence of his luxurious apartment, surrounded by cold furniture and works of art that no longer inspired pride, he began to view his own choices as open wounds. The public humiliation had destroyed his image, but it was the void left by Emily that tore at his soul. For the first time in years he felt small, vulnerable, human. The nights were long, the thoughts incessant. He remembered her expression, firm even in the face of cruelty, and compared it to his own life marked by excess and empty achievements. The words Emily had spoken, "I already knew everything," thundered like an echo impossible to silence. And then he began to realize what he had never considered. Power lay not in money, but in dignity, in the silence that does not bend, in the strength of those who face the world with nothing but their own courage. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, painful, marked by internal downfalls more violent than any headline. He found himself alone in empty meetings, abandoned by allies who had once flattered him. He felt the bitter taste of being looked at with contempt, the same sensation he had witnessed with Emily. Every hostile gesture, every closed door, became a lesson. And so, little by little, he began to understand what true karma was, not the blatant revenge, but the silent justice that forced him to taste the same poison he had helped spread. The millionaire began visiting places he'd previously ignored. He was seen in shelters, in small communities, not with press cameras to capture them, but alone, in silence, trying to find a shred of humanity amidst the chaos. He spoke to people who had lost everything, listening to stories of suffering that seemed like reflections of Emily's past. And the more he listened, the more he felt the need to make amends, even though he knew there was no sufficient reparation for the mistakes of the past. He no longer sought public redemption. The transformation taking place within him was intimate, almost secret. He knew the world might never forgive him, but he understood he needed to change or drown in his own regret. Emily had planted a seed in him, and now that seed was growing, breaking through the layers of pride and arrogance that imprisoned him. It didn't matter how much money he had lost, nor how badly his image had been ruined. For the first time, he felt he was beginning to see. If you believe that true change comes from pain, subscribe to the channel now, like it and write in the comments, "Do." You believe that falls can be the beginning of a transformation? The reunion didn't take place in a luxurious salon, nor in a popular restaurant like before. It was on a grey afternoon, in a small community bookstore in the neighborhood, a simple, quiet place filled with forgotten stories on worn shelves. He had begun visiting places like these in search of peace, of answers he'd never found in the large glass offices. He expected nothing more than anonymity. But as he walked through the narrow, wooden door, he stopped as if the world had frozen. Emily was there. She wore simple clothes, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders, and her expression conveyed the same dignity as always, but now with an almost impenetrable serenity. She was arranging some books on a makeshift table for children who were leafing through stories in hushed tones. When their eyes met, time seemed to dissolve. There were no shouts, no blatant surprise, just that dense silence that speaks louder than any words. He approached slowly, his steps unsteady, as if each movement were too heavy. He was no longer the haughty man he'd once been. There was humility in his posture, almost a silent plea in his eyes. Emily didn't look away, but she didn't smile either. She waited. He stopped in front of her, and for the first time his voice sounded fragile. "I need to talk to you." The waitress from the past, now stronger and more self-aware, remained calm. "About what?" she asked firmly. He swallowed, searching for the words he had so often rehearsed in the silence of his own guilt. "About everything, about what happened, about what I did, about who I was." Emily crossed her arms, the weight of memory etched in every line of her face. "Do you think words can erase what has been destroyed?" He lowered his eyes, unable to sustain the just accusation. "No, I know you didn't. But I want you to know that nothing that happened went unnoticed by me, and that since that day I've never been the same." The sincerity in his voice wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't a social mask. He was a broken man trying to find some semblance of redemption. The children ran around, laughing, leafing through books, as if fate had chosen this innocent setting to contrast with the weight of that conversation. Emily took a deep breath. The reunion he had so longed for was finally happening, but there was no immediate relief. There was only the tension of two stories intertwined by the past, pain and revelation. She said nothing for what seemed like an eternity. She simply watched him, as if weighing not her words but the transformation in the eyes of the man who had once represented everything she hated. And it was in that silence that he understood. Forgiveness would not be granted easily. Their reunion was not an end, but a silent judgment yet to come. The silence between them seemed to drag on, heavy, dense, as if each second were a judgment. Emily kept her eyes fixed on him, and that gaze held. More than pain, it held the entire story of someone who had been crushed and yet refused to be destroyed. He, in turn, no longer held the poise he once had. His shoulders slumped, his voice choked. Everything about him showed that the empire of arrogance had crumbled, leaving only an ordinary man faced with his own guilt. "What do you want from me?" she asked firmly, without raising her voice, but with a force that pierced him like a blade. He took a deep breath, struggling with his own words, until he answered with naked sincerity, "I just want you to know that I regret it, that I understand the harm I caused. I'm not here to ask you to forget, nor to ask you to accept it. I just want you to know that if I could go back, I would do things differently." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching her memories for the answer. She remembered her stolen childhood, her lost home, her sick mother, the days of hunger and shame. She remembered the cruel bet at McDonald's, the bill, thrown as alms, and the feeling of carrying on her shoulders not only the humiliation of that day, but of a lifetime. But she also remembered his silence in that moment, his outstretched hand as everyone laughed, and the transformation she now saw before her. "Do you know what forgiveness means?" she asked. He nodded, but his voice was shaky. "It means freedom, but not for me, for you." Emily sighed. "No, forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to carry the weight of hate. I won't absolve you of what you did, but I also won't hold on to the poison you tried to instill in me. I choose to move on." He looked up, hopeful for a moment. "So, you forgive me?" Emily remained firm. "No, I don't forgive, but I don't wish you ruin either. What I want is distance. What I want is to live my life without your name or your shadow reaching me. That is my justice, my goodbye." The words fell like a sentence. There was no hatred in her voice, but there was a dignity so absolute that it struck him harder than any scream. The millionaire felt his legs weaken, his heart crushed by the weight of the decision. There was no easy redemption, no miraculous reconciliation. There was only the emptiness of goodbye, an emptiness that would echo forever within him. Emily grabbed her simple bag, said goodbye to the innocently smiling children in the bookstore, and walked out the door without a backward glance. The sound of the wood closing was the last thing he heard before he found himself alone, surrounded only by dusty books and the deafening silence of destiny fulfilled. The rain fell lightly that night, reflecting the streetlights in the puddles that spread across the asphalt. The millionaire walked alone, without an umbrella, his suit soaked, his shoes sinking into the water as if each step were a silent penance. He passed a McDonald's and instinctively stopped. Inside, other waitresses hurried with trays, customers laughed loudly, children played with colorful boxes. Everything seemed the same as the day he first saw her, but now the scene no longer held the same weight. He watched for a few minutes, motionless, as if staring into a mirror of a time that would never return. Across the street, a young woman with a red umbrella walked, shielding a child running beside her. Her childish laughter cut through the grey night air, and for a moment the millionaire thought he saw her, her hair, her walk, her firm posture. But when he looked up to confirm, the street was empty. All that remained was the sound of the rain, and his heart racing with the ghost of a presence that would never be his again. He took a deep breath, shoved his hands in his pockets, and continued walking, disappearing into the city's lights and shadows. The invisible camera of life slowly moved away, revealing the vastness of the wet streets, while the solitary figure became just another lost dot in the night. There was no explanation, no final word, only the silence of poetic justice. Served the memory of a look that had changed everything, and the weight of a destiny that could never be rewritten. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So I want you to comment below with the sentence, "Justice always arrives," just so I know you stayed with me until the end. Don't forget to leave your like. It helps a lot to bring more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next videos full of emotion, destiny, and twists. And don't look away. There's another video playing here on the screen, and I'm sure it will give you as much goosebumps as this one. Click and continue this journey with me.